thank you all for coming. It's really nice to see kind of so many faces. Because yes, I did a little introduction together with Chris last time, and yes, me and Alicia and another friend, we started this a few years ago, and then after a few years, when you still are here and come back, it's kind of quite amazing to see it still going, and kind of even to a greater extent. So yeah, here it's not November, it's October. I hope there are not other mistakes. Just a little warning, so I've given a very similar lecture for paper 0 2 years ago, so if any of you were there then, please don't be disappointed that this will be more or less like a repetition, but I don't really recognize many faces, so probably it's not a real warning. Okay, so I will just kick off with a quote by Simon Wren-Lewis, who some of you might know is kind of one of the economists who would classify themselves not necessarily as neoclassical, but certainly as mainstream. And he observed that mainstream economics has become dominant because it has proved far more useful than all of its heterodox alternatives put together. Its response to data and events may be slow compared to the normal sciences for obvious reasons, but it is progressive. This is because mainstream economics can be remarkably flexible. And I put this quote on the slide because I think it nicely demonstrates what is the prevailing views among the mainstream economists on how knowledge advances through time. Or in other words, how certain ideas evolved into kind of the dominant or the prevailing ones. So as you all know, at kind of different points in history, there are different ideas which count as true. An obvious example is in the, pre-Socratic times, the kind of the truthful representation of Earth was that it's a flat surface, and it also counted as the center of the universe. Then already kind of Aristotle rejected the idea of the flat Earth, that it's actually a spherical object, and then with the scientific revolution, also the center of the universe was decentered away from Earth. So how is it that at one point something is believed as true, and then, a few hundreds years later something else? And this is something that also philosophers, among others, try to explain. And they come up, with different explanation how it is the case that historically different ideas are considered as kind of what we believe, not as some opinions, subjective beliefs, but it's actually some kind of objective knowledge. And one of the dominant views in this field, in the evolution of ideas, kind of within philosophy, people would also talk about this as philosophy of science, is that it's based on this idea of progress. So that there is something intrinsic about the ideas that kind of tends to come out over time as truth. And so there is also this some presumed kind of automism or some kind of automatic mechanism which makes these things happen. And it is not only that there is these tendencies that, some ideas are intrinsically better than others, and eventually scientists will discover that and kind of articulate them into theories. There is also this notion that whatever comes afterwards, it must be better than what has come before. And yes, we can see here kind of what Wren-Lewis is suggesting, that he claims, so he tries to explain why mainstream economics has become dominant, and he comes back to this notion of progress, as well as he, here not necessarily to the notion of truth, but he refers to the criteria of usefulness, but often kind of those two categories are closely intertwined. Okay, and kind of instead of trying now to come up with a very comprehensive explanation of what alternative theories are on how knowledge advances over time. I will try to do it a bit differently and just give you one historical example which tries to kind of speak against this prevailing view, which most of the economists would accept. And with this historical example, I want to illustrate a broader theory which says that there are many important political and social factors which affect which ideas eventually come to be acknowledged as truth and which not. So in other words, I want to argue that what is now accepted as valid knowledge is not necessarily so only because there is something intrinsically better, objectively, about those ideas, but it's also because of the certain political and social circumstances. And kind of what do I mean by those political and social factors? It's kind of quite obvious things which often have to do with power relations in the society. So it's the question of what are particular prevailing political regimes? Is it parliamentary democracy? Is it totalitarian government? Then is the question who actually holds power in those society? Is it the property-owning men in ancient Athens, or is it multinational corporations and oil-rich nations today? Then it is also related to questions how it is that power is actually legitimized in those society. Is it through religious faith up until the Middle Ages, or is it through the notion of reason, which is kind of the notion we refer to today? Then it's also the question of how is actually the power enforced. Is it primarily through violence? Is it through law? Is it through both? So what you should keep in mind is that in no way I will today prove this assertion that political and social factors matter when it comes to which theories we perceive as true. Kind of the only thing that I want to do is kind of to challenge and to shatter this prevailing belief, which kind of comes quite implied when most of us are when we first come to face with economics. And the kind of the particular historical example I will talk about is the involvement of certain American businessmen in the early post-war era and their connection to neoliberalism. And I want to argue that one of the reasons why kind of neoliberalism evolved into this effective ideology is also because they, to a large extent, relied on the financial support of those American businessmen. But before I go on, I just want to make two short clarifications. One is about the distinction between neoclassical economics and neoliberalism. Of course, they are not exactly the same thing. They are two distinct words, but certainly their meanings also do overlap to a large extent. They are used in different contexts. As I said, neoliberalism usually refers to a political ideology, whereas by neoclassical economics, we usually mean a school of economic thought, kind of a discipline of social science. But what they do share is quite a large bunch of certain normative assumptions about what society is, what is good and what is bad for us. One of those assumptions is about the primary role that individual, kind of the entity that of the individual has in the society. The other one is the role of free market. Then there is also a very strong or a narrow conception of freedom, of liberty, that both neoclassical and neoliberalism share. And that conception of freedom refers to primarily kind of the ability to freely exchange things on the market. It is closely overlapped with the notion of negative freedom. So it's kind of this: I'm free as long as no one interferes with me. but then there are other notions of freedom. So the positive freedom, for example, it is, am I free to do stuff? And that is certainly left out in both the neoclassical and neoliberal views. And as you will see, kind of the people who are represented both as neoliberals and neoclassicals tend to be, at least in these early beginnings, more or less the same bunch. Then the other clarification is that, yes, I don't, as I said, I'm not proving my case here. I'm also not trying to come up with a comprehensive explanation of the rise of neoliberalism and neoclassical economics. All I'm doing is presenting you one factor, one reason that certainly played a role. Okay, now we can come to the main part, and this is the historical plot of and the relationship that these American businessmen in the 1940s and 1950s had to specifically certain neoliberal organizations whose explicit objective was to introduce certain new ideas more widely into the public sphere. And it all, in a way, started in the early 1930s when the New Deal, so the Roosevelt's economic program, was actually getting more and more support among the public. And for clear reasons, the New Deal was actually against the interests of many, especially larger corporations. Well, why was this the case? So what were the main kind of policies introduced through the New Deal? One had to do with the increased federal regulation of the economy. It strengthened the power that the labor unions had, as well as it introduced a whole variety of social programs. And this group of businessmen, which included both kind of retired executives from the large corporations as well as from smaller firms, they kind of had different strategies in how they were opposing to this New Deal liberalism. One was to directly disseminate different tactics to the companies by which those companies could fight their unions. One kind of more direct one was by supporting certain candidates in the parliamentary politics who were fond of their views. Then a group of, kind of specifically, one group of businessmen worked with the National Association of Manufacturers, which focused on mobilizing businessmen themselves and disseminating the anti-union strategies. Other groups like Fred Schwartz, Christian Anti-Communist Crusade, were more populist organizations who were seeking to educate the citizens about the dangers of the communism and socialism and generally the far left. However, one of kind of most easily accessible strategies of those businessmen and one of most widely spread ones was, as I already mentioned before, in creating and then directly funding conservative think tanks. One example of those conservative think tanks is the Foundation for Economic Education, as well as the American Enterprise Association, which was later renamed into what is nowadays the American Enterprise Institute. And the main objective of those think tanks was to articulate economic philosophy centered on the idea of the free market and to disseminate then this vision more widely into the public sphere, especially in the sphere of kind of the intellectual elite, such as journalists, politicians, and other businessmen. And what was kind of crucial that those think tanks did was to somehow capture what the interest of those businessmen was, not in the very narrow terms, but into some kind of a broader political view which would encapsulate also those immediate interests. Okay, so let me give you an example what I mean by this. So it is very obvious that those businessmen were they were opposing to the increases they were opposing to the increases in taxes on the corporate profit, which was also part of the New Deal. But it is quite difficult to secure public support against such a measure if all I can tell you, higher taxes on profit is bad for me and for my rich friends. It's better to somehow articulate it into a term where I can explain it to you so that it's actually that those higher taxes are bad for you as well. So then I start talking not about that higher taxes on corporate profit are bad, but I also start talking why higher taxes as such are bad. And then I generalize it even more and not talk only about the taxes, but talk about state as such as being a bad thing. So, this discourse certainly happened already before, but it was certainly also after the post-war era that this notion of the big state became perceived as something inherently bad. And when that notion kind of receives public recognition as something bad, then it is also much easier for me to secure kind of general public support against the increases on taxes on corporate profit, which actually will benefit just me because I'm the one who is making profit in this corporation and not you. So then they were, as I said, those businessmen were active in many smaller and bigger think tanks, but one that became very influential and it still exists today, it's the so-called Montpellier Society. And the two of the founding members of this society were Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. And so now I will talk a little bit about what this Montpellier Society was. It was founded in 1947 at a meeting that was held in Montpellier, which is a resort next to Lake Geneva. I think I have a picture. Yes. And yes, besides Hayek and von Mises, other kind of influential founding members were Karl Popper and Milton Friedman. Here, so this is a photo taken at a conference a decade later, and I couldn't really find who is on the picture, but apparently Friedman is somewhere. I don't know where. Then another member of the founding committee was Eli Heckscher, which some of you might know from the Heckscher-Oakley model, the trade model. No, okay. So the Montpellier Society, the NPS for sure, was founded to advance and integrate types of very specialized knowledge, which was not confined to a particular discipline, but kind of reached over fields of economics, history, sociology, and to then articulate those ideas so that they would be easily introduced and propagated more widely into the public sphere. And a lot what those NPS members did was, met at different kind of occasions, events, conferences, and then talked, and also published. But like perhaps at this instance, this idea of how knowledge actually gets integrated more widely into the society might sound quite abstract, and I've come across quite a good example of how at the end this comes down to very down-to-earth practices. Also, so at the end there will be a reading from which I took most of this material, and in this book they refer to the operational structure of those intellectual networks, such as the think tanks. They say it can be described kind of in terms of how military works, so that it can be divided into long-range artillery, into short-range artillery, and then into the actual war zone. So what the long-range artillery of those intellectual networks does is kind of organize academic production of knowledge. So this is kind of what happens at the university and then at universities and then gets published in journals. But of course that is not really what most of the people other than academics would read. So then there comes kind of the short-range artillery, which consists of kind of organizations which are somewhere in between the real public sphere and the academia. And this consists of think tanks and of journalists who work with those think tanks, and these organizations are then dedicating of transferring the knowledge that gets produced in the universities onto the other side where most of the people live. And those ideas then often appear in formats such as book reviews, interviews, which then appear also in the public press, in more popular press. Then they give kind of speeches at various kind of dinner conferences which non-academics attend as well. And then kind of the last part of that operational structure of intellectual network is the war zone, and this is then what nowadays would probably be the parliament or kind of that sphere of politics where it comes down to kind of very hand-to-hand combat and where actually laws get passed. And kind of the NPS had in that early post-war era a very large influence in probably here we would classify it in this short-range artillery. And it can, in a way, everyone recognizes the influence that the NPS has, and it can hardly be overestimated. It is kind of widely recognized that it was a very influential. It had a very influential say in the setting up of the Washington Consensus, which often is also represented as being something non-partisan. And do you know what I mean by the Washington Consensus? Is kind of the set of neoliberal policies which was kind of forced onto many of the developing nations and which determined lots of their later development. So how do then those American businessmen come into the story of the Montpellier Society? Well, as I said, one of the main ways of how those businessmen were trying to gain public support for their immediate interest was by funding different organizations that whose objective they shared. And now I will say something a little bit more about one specific example, about a certain individual, namely Jasper Elliot Crane, who was a former executive at one of the big chemical companies in the state, namely the DuPont Chemical Company. And I think this kind of his involvement in the NPS really nicely illustrates the point of that lecture, that in a way the financial support which the NPS gained was critical for their eventual growth and then the effective propagation of the ideas they believed in. Even Hayek himself recognized the importance that, yes, very tangible thing money has when it comes to the ideas of politics, moral, and religions. And in one of his work, he noted that if minority works are to ever have a chance to become majority views, they would need to rely on the financial support of wealthy people. And so that company of which Jasper Crane was an executive in 1930s already then played a big role in the opposition to the New Deal policies. Before its involvement with the NPS, it founded another neoliberal think tank called the American Liberty League, which did not survive, and it was an organization that claimed to be devoted to teaching the American people about the right to work, earn, save, and acquire property, and to preserve the ownership and lawful use of property when acquired. And then, as I said, yes, it was opposed to the New Deal, and in one of their pamphlets, they described the New Deal as representing the attempt in America to set up, maybe I have this on the slide, yeah, the attempt in America to set up a totalitarian government, one which recognizes no sphere of individual or business life as immune from governmental authority, and which submerges the welfare of the individual to that of the government. And as I said, this American Liberty League didn't really last long, and one of the reasons why it fell apart was also because apparently journalists portrayed it as really an organization that is dominated by a very few rich people who only strike to protect their own interest. And this is certainly a reputation that the NPS has never really acquired, although in a way they were doing very much the same thing as the American Liberty League, but in a different way. So the now who is the protagonist of our story, this Jasper Elliot Crane, he was not very active in the American Liberty League, but in the 1940s he served as the trustee for the Foundation for Economic Education, which was another of those conservative think tanks, as well as he chaired a National Association of Manufacturers, which sound kind of a very neutral, perhaps, organization, but one of the committees, they had dealt with trying to persuade churches from allying themselves with movements to win social protection and advantage for labor. But so then when kind of Crane was retiring and he got more deeply involved into kind of various kinds of political activism, he was trying to come up with a firmer theoretical and intellectual background for the ideas he believed are truth. And in his words, he was trying to find a New Testament of capitalism, or kind of the Bible of free enterprise. And eventually he said he found that in the NPS. And he first came across Hayek in 1947, and he approached him whether he could attend this foundational meeting in which I mentioned by Lake Geneva in 1947. But then Hayek was not, he refused to accept this request. He expressed his doubts how kind of the public would perceive the participation of non-academics at kind of a more academic conference. And he wrote to Crane that that was his refusal for Crane to attend the conference, and he said, "I think you will agree that experience has shown that any effort in the sphere of ideas, if it to be effective, must avoid even the appearance of being dependent on any material interest, and that for reason we have been careful not to include in the list of persons originally invited anyone, however sympathetic with our aims, who might be thought by the public to represent specific interests." So we see here that although on one hand Hayek was very much aware that in order to ever succeed in propagating the neoliberal ideas into the wider public, they need money just in order to meet with the same-minded people, but on the other hand, he also took great care of not making that too evident to the public. But instead of simply refusing Crane to attend this conference and to become a full member of the NPS, he still cultivated a certain relation with him, which was he treated him as a potential donor. So in that same letter, Hayek mentioned to Crane that nevertheless they would very much welcome any kind of financial contribution by him. And then in the late 40s and early 50s, the NPS was actually in quite kind of deep financial difficulties. They were trying to organize a big conference in the States, but they couldn't. And then in the 1948, Hayek came back to Crane, kind of explaining all the difficulties they have in their fundraising activities, saying that while I see daily how the international context of the leftist groups, and particularly the communists, almost unlimited means seem to be available, and in consequence, the closest coordination of their systemic efforts possible, I have so far failed to obtain any funds to speak of for similar endeavors on the liberal side. So then Hayek asked Crane to directly fund one of those big American meetings, but at that time Crane still had, I don't know exactly what, but he thought there were still too large ideological distinctions between the ideas he himself had and the ideas that NPS was defending. But then in the 1958, Crane changed his mind, and he actually stepped forward and took on a leading role in a big fundraising event in order to fund eventually this big American meeting of the NPS. And he spent basically almost 2 years raising money, sending letters to kind of hundreds and hundreds of prominent conservative businessmen, as well as to smaller right-wing foundations. And he urged the prospective donors by the following words. He said that it is ironic that an organization to advance the ideas which have found their fullest expression in America has never had a meeting there. And at the end, Crane succeeded in this fundraising effort. He persuaded more than 40 very wealthy individuals and raised more than $40,000, which was eventually enough to fund this big American meeting, which then took place in Princeton. So the second picture I showed was from there in 1958. It was one of the largest conferences that the NPS held in history, and all of its prominent members spoke on topics such as what is liberty, how it is related to property, what is the meaning of freedom, and so on. And as I said, kind of this meeting in 1958 marked kind of the beginning of the broader relationship that the American businessmen had with the theorists of the NPS societies. And since then, conservative foundations continued to donate money to fund the travel costs and other meetings that the NPS had. And I think this conference still happens perhaps now at a biannual basis around the world. And it's still perhaps not as active as it was in the 1960s, but still very much alive. Just to give you one of kind of very concrete examples of other types of involvement between that sphere of business and of the academic production of ideas. In 1964, Hayek and Friedman circulated a prospectus for a book which was entitled Principles of Freedom, and it was addressed to primarily an audience of undergraduates, and that publication was then eventually sponsored by some large corporations such as the General Electric, the DuPont, the chemical company that I mentioned before, as well as the Shell Oil and US Steel. And I think with this, I come to an end of my story, and I think I'm also on time. So let me kind of just sum up what I tried to convey today. So I started off with the idea that there are diverse ways of how we can understand the evolution of certain ideas into dominant theories or into certain paradigms. And there is one particular view which dominates the economics faculties today, which is that there is something intrinsic in certain ideas that eventually wins over the competitive ideas and thus prevails. But I try to kind of question that theory by providing you with one specific historical example, which I find nicely illustrates that we cannot really consider the rise of certain ideas over certain others independently, as if that was happening in kind of some bubble that is separate from the actual historical, political, and social context. And I think I went into enough detail, and it was not very complicated that I would need to reiterate that plot. And now this also leaves us, I think, with enough time for questions. And I think here I put, so if you want to know more about what neoliberalism is, it's a very nice introduction by David Harvey, a Marxist economist. And then most of kind of the historical stuff that I talked about today comes from this also a nice book, The Roads from Montpellier, The Making of the Neoliberal Thought Collective, which is a nice and not too difficult read. And then I also put an essay question, which Chris mentioned already last time. We know you are busy. We don't expect you to write another essay for us, but it is an option. And if anyone felt a strong desire to explore this topic more broadly and wrote something down, I would be more than happy to read and to talk about it. Okay.
Thank you very much, Nina. So, do we have any questions from you guys? Hi.
Hi. I was wondering if you thought there are any schools of economic thought which have grown and developed purely on their merit as opposed to the social, historical, and political.
You mean if I recognize that merit is also one of the factors that comes into play when we consider the evolution, or if I'm like a total kind of skeptic that it's all relative, it's all equally good, and what comes out is purely by the certain power relations.
Yeah, more or less. If there's anyone which you think is sort of more...
So what is like my personal... But I don't kind of like to classify myself into a particular school of thought, which is also probably why I would say that there are different schools of economics thoughts have different tools which can then answer different types of questions, and that whatever question you have, then you have to start with it and then consider which school might be better to answer those. I wouldn't, be comfortable to say there is one that is better than other. But certainly, I think there are some things which I believe a school or a certain theory needs to have if I believe that there is telling me something valuable. And for example, with neoclassical economics, it leaves out history completely, and that's why then I can be very skeptical if it can be useful at all. So I'm kind of giving you more like a negative answer than a positive one.
Any more questions? Yes.
So, to what extent is this story complicated by a tension between business interests and even the free market school of thought? Because in the free market school of thought, large corporate entities are as much of a threat to the market structure and the way that it operates as the state did, and often tend to collude with the state even more than sort of labor would. And so you'll see factions within that school of thought that are arguing much more against corporation and trying to deal with the same problems as the left. So, can you take that?
So, for example, that monopolies are in neoclassical recognized as a bad thing, or
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, they might be recognized as a bad thing, but then at the same time they are also recognized as not really existent. They're presented more as like an extreme, kind of as one side of the pole. And at least when I was studying economics for my undergraduate, we were always told, yes, monopolies are bad, but they don't really exist. So you don't have to worry about them. So I feel in this case, yes, there is kind of an irrational argument why they are bad for kind of the efficiency of the market, but that they're actually having quite a big role in the real world that was never touched on in my lectures, at least.
Another question, yeah, at the back?
You talk purely about neoliberalism and how think tanks influence that, but isn't it true that there are think tanks of all sorts, like, you know, at the Saviour Society promoting left-wing policies in the UK, on more extremist end we've got the Communist International.
Yeah.
So why haven't they succeeded?
It did.
If this is such an important influence of the economic policies, why haven't these other funded ones as well?
Yeah, well, that I find it's a very interesting and very relevant question. I think at the end it comes down to very concrete factors and conditions. It might have to kind of what one might think it's kind of irrelevant, but at the end is like perhaps Hayek was just a more charismatic person and was able to charm certain donors, whereas whoever was the president of another organization, he couldn't. And I think at the end, it's kind of those factors which you have to group them together, and then as a group they kind of have some explanatory power of why certain organization was more successful than the other. I think at the end it's often a question of very practical strategies and nature.
Just a comment. I really liked the overview that you gave, but I think having been involved, with some of the people on the left, they like to paint the picture of the emergence of ideology, used in the sort of leftist kind of term of ideology of discourse or whatever, as a very sinister emergence, right? But I think counter to that, like what you mentioned, the metaphor of warfare from that writer, I don't think it's necessarily as stark as that. Like this is, I think, just like the sphere of discourse and engagement, mutual engagement, and the struggle for which ideas emerge, right? And I don't think it's necessarily as insidious. It's like it's probably better to look at it as a history of ideas than as a some sort of, what do you call it, like a secret, like a goal of only one organization, because any organization will have their own sort of ideological tendencies and wish to maintain that or establish that in some sort of normative structure. Even things like, Black Lives Matter, for instance, will have their own way of engaging with discourse, whether it is like overt or covert.
Yeah, no, I certainly, I completely agree, and I really don't want to kind of lead this impression I'm some kind of a Marxist preaching you about different conspiracies that have happened in history. And certainly, yes, most of the books you will read on kind of the rise of neoliberalism will portray it in those terms of how intellectual historians like to express themselves, and they will also kind of illustrate it in a kind of more comprehensive sense than I did here. My objective was more like to kind of point to some very specific examples that, in order to emphasize that this is also what matters, but certainly not that that it was something unique to the rise of neoliberalism and that it doesn't happen elsewhere. Yeah, but thanks.
Thank you for the presentation. If I can, I just want to make a comment and ask a question. So I thought that when there was a question about the economists, about, or rather, yeah, how economics progresses also through the relevance and value of ideas, and not only the power play at a social academic level. But what I think is interesting to consider is that many of the economists that are now recognized as being either having alternative views to the mainstream or politically, or doing some work that is beyond the scope of neoclassical economists. For example, Amartya Sen have started with mastering the subject matter of neoclassical economics. The Nobel for Amartya Sen was not for capability theory. It was for his mathematical methods of aggregating data. And the same, for example, interestingly, happened with Yanis Varoufakis, who went into the game theory specifically. He explained it later, as this is very mutual subject matter, when he did not have to engage his political ideas. And only after he achieved his success there, he was free to kind of talk about other stuff as well. So that's as a more general comment. It's interesting in that sense that as those ideas have succeeded, and that was part of Montpellier Society was trying to do, as it was established as the common sense and the ground, the kind of subject matter of the economics. You need to start from that. You can't, and if you're beyond that, you're kind of left out of the political spectrum. As for example, now either Stiglitz or Krugman, who are quoted as the heroes of liberal or left, are neoclassical economists. And then my question was actually just to do a bit with about maths. So I wanted to ask, where in this story is maths entering the picture of neoclassical economics, which is a large part of it, remembering that both Hayek and Mises were very skeptical of use of it for economics.
But
Yes.
so I do want you to answer that question. You guys know each other, and you can talk about it later. Because I do want us to get into a habit of ending promptly. So I'll just say, if you have any more questions for either of us, please just send us an email. Definitely reply. I don't know if you had Nina's, but
Yeah, it was at the.
okay.
Yeah, there.
And a reminder for those of you who weren't here last week, if you, during the course of these lectures go on for this term and for next term, and over the course of these 2 terms, if you come to 50% or more of the lectures, you get a diploma from us as sort of as a thanks for taking the additional time to come to these. And I think thanks, that is genuinely important, because as I said last week, you guys don't have to do this, and it's great to see that you are interested in the content, and we really appreciate you coming down. And yeah, just again, because it's in your lunch break, remember you can just bring your lunch if you want to, okay, because a lot of you I know have classes immediately afterwards. Just so you know. And did the handout sheet, the sign-up sheet, make its way around? Is that anywhere? Someone's. So I don't know if anyone at the top got it. It's just going to be at the back, and just sign it as you come down if you would like the emails. Okay, so let's give a round of applause for Nina again.